this is back in, I'm trying to remember, late 80s. I wrote a story which was probably the most popular story I ever wrote for the International Examiner in the years I was there. And it was talking about community journalism. And it was written because there was a dynamic tension between folks who were moving into the mainstream, Asian American journalists, who were interested in professional development and breaking the glass ceiling. And so there you had people on that track. And then you had other folks who were community journalists who really were less, trained, more street journalists, and folks who were really involved in causes as much as writing about these things. The Asian American journalists in the mainstream, of course, you have to keep your distance and so forth, and you're real conscious of that. Others at the community level were really working with no resources and were embedded in a lot of the causes. So question of, so who is a real journalist, and issues of elitism and balance and so forth. So I wrote a piece supporting the notion that community journalists, which I considered myself one of them, had as much legitimacy and abilities as others who've been, put up on a pedestal within the, kind of mainstream, the Connie Chungs and some of the others, just to use a name. And so that just sparked a lot of dialogue and conversation, because I think a lot of community journalists had been feeling for a long time that they just, were being disregarded for their role in the community. And I told a story about a Japanese-American individual who documented a lot of the community, had this big ancient tape recorder, and he was the editor of the Japanese-American Citizens League newsletter. And it was a mimeographed kind of little thing. And I used to look at it all the time for story ideas and just figure out what's going on, because he knew everybody in the community. And it was an amazing piece of journalism. Now, people would look at it and say, well, that's not a newspaper, he's not a journalist, and so forth. Likewise, there were a number of efforts. I know there's a publication called Northwest Indian News, which was published for many years. And I don't recall what their specific source of their funding was, but I knew folks who worked for that publication. There's a woman named Ella Aquino, who was actually half Filipino and half Native American, who was similar to this other guy, Ira Nagoka, who produced the JACL newsletter. And anytime you look at her column, you find out exactly what's happening in the community, because she knew everybody. She was well respected, and was this journalism or not? But that dynamic tension still continues, I think, to this day. You have people, a whole wealth of ethnic community publications, both in English as well as in Asian languages, and where do they fit in our society? What kind of support do they get, and do we provide? What kind of respect do we provide for them? So I weighed in on that issue, and it just this flood of people saying, yeah, wow, I'm glad somebody spoke out for us, because we were here, and yet when you have these Asian American Journalists Conference, nobody can afford to go, because you're sort of the poor cousins that are doing stuff unacknowledged and unappreciated. More recently, as I've entered the museum profession, there's actually a parallel, which is the ethnic-specific museums, and then also the mainstream museums, which employ Asian Americans, because there's now been some movement of Asian Americans into the mainstream, not as much as needs to be in order for there to be even approaching equity, but then, so where do we sit? The ethnic-specific museums, the tribal museums, the inner-city storefront museums, in the constellation of museums in general, and are we receiving our share of respect, professional courtesy, and funding to ensure that our operations are successful?